Chapter 7. The next morning, Venus did not come to school. At recess time, I went down to the main office to phone her house. "Hello?" answered a thick, sleepy-sounding voice. I said who I was and why I was phoning. Was Venus there? Huh? What? Don't know. The voice at the other end replied. Then the line went dead. I dialed again. Again the same sluggish, sleepy voice. I couldn't actually tell if it was male or female. Female, I guessed, but not Wanda. Once more I explained I was Venus' teacher and I was concerned because Venus was not at school. I said we'd had a disagreement the previous day and I was worried that Venus might still be upset. "Is this Venus' mother?" I asked. The person at the other end was incoherent. Drunk, possibly. Whatever, I couldn't make sense of the call. As a consequence, I decided to visit Venus' house after school. Normally I didn't do this without giving the parents ample warning, but I was more than a little concerned about having allowed her to leave the school premises the day before in the state she was, and I wanted to see for myself that Venus was all right. Moreover, I wanted to make it perfectly plain to whomever was in charge at her house that unless she was ill, Venus had to attend school. This wasn't a choice Venus or Wanda could make. It was the law. Julie came with me. Venus and her family lived about 5 blocks from the school down one of the city side streets between the railroad and the meat packing plant. Although it was now known as an area of crime and drugs, a century earlier when the town had been founded, it had been laid out with broad sidewalks and boulevards planted with elm and cottonwood trees. The elms had long since succumbed to disease and been cut down, but the cottonwoods had thrived, having up the decaying sidewalks and casting the whole area into dense shade. Most of the houses had been built between the two world wars. None of them were large houses, but most had porches and broad lawns. Now, however, the porches were broken down and unpainted. Many houses had boarded-up windows, and the lawns, unwatered and too shaded by the big trees, were worn largely to dirt. Venus' home was not a house but a trailer set back on an empty lot. It was old and fitted permanently to a concrete foundation. The screen door was hanging open and a man sat on the doorstep. I parked the car and got out. He was a skinny, small-built man, probably 2 or 3 inches shorter than I was. His hair was the nondescript color, somewhere between dark blonde and light brown, and it was rather wavy, rumpled almost, as if he hadn't bothered to brush it when he got up. He had a thick growth of stubble and a very hairy chest showing through his unbuttoned shirt. He sat smoking a cigarette and watching us come up the path to the front door. "Hello, I'm Venus' teacher from school." "Well, hi," he said in a distinctly lascivious manner that made me very grateful for having Julie along. "Is Venus here?" He considered this a moment, as if it were a difficult question, then smiled. "Could be. You want a seat?" "Is she?" A slow, rather insolent shrug. "I reckon. Venus didn't come to school today. I'm concerned about her. It's very important that Venus come every day, unless she's ill. So, is she here?" "Why? You want to see her?" he asked, but before I could respond, he leaned back and called over his shoulder. "Terry? Someone here about Venus. Terry?" There was no response. The man smiled at me in a casual way. "Are you Venus' father? You think all these black bastards are mine?" A woman, perhaps in her late 30s, appeared in the doorway behind him. She had shoulder-length hair, cornrowed neatly into small braids, and looked as if she just woke up, despite it being 3:30 in the afternoon. She blinked against the late summer sunlight. "Who are you?" I explained again who I was and why I was there. "Oh, fuck," the woman said wearily. "Wanda," she shouted over her shoulder. "Wanda, what the fuck you done? Didn't you take Venus to school again?" Wanda stumbled to the doorway. The woman turned. "What you done, you lame brain? Why didn't you take her to school today?" "Beautiful child," Wanda said and smiled gently. "Yeah, a beautiful child you one of these days. Why didn't you take her to school?" "Her no-go school," Wanda replied plaintively. "Yes, her do-go school, you big fucking idiot. How many times you got to be told? You're good for nothing." The woman raised her arm as if to hit Wanda, but she didn't. Wanda scared off. The woman turned back to me. "Look, I'm sorry. It won't happen again. Are you Venus' mother?" "Yeah." She ran her hands through her hair, pushing the braids back. She was a rather pretty woman in a tired sort of way. "Could I talk with you a moment about Venus?" "Why? What's she done?" "She hasn't done anything. I was just wondering, could we chat a moment? I was hoping you could fill me in a little on her background." The woman rubbed her face in a weary fashion and backed aside. "Yeah, come on in, if you want." I stepped gingerly by the man, still sitting in the doorway. Julie, who was wearing a skirt, pressed it to do her legs as she edged by. The man grinned up at us. Inside there were two teenage girls and a boy sprawled over the furniture in front of the TV. Beyond there was a built-in table with bench seats on either side. Wanda sat on one. She was doing nothing but staring at her hands. "Get out of here, you guys," the woman said. "Turn off that fucking box. I told you half an hour ago to turn that off." "Shut up, bitch," the boy said. He must have been about 12 or 13. The woman raised her foot and kicked his leg none too gently. "Get moving." He muttered crossly, got up and went outside. "Terry," the man called from the doorway, "get me another beer while you are at it." "Get it yourself," she replied. "Frenchie, hey Frenchie, get me a beer." I didn't know which one was Frenchie, as there was no response from any of the people in the room. "Wanda," he called. "Wanda, get me a beer." Lumbering out of her seat, Wanda plodded to the refrigerator. She yanked the door open so hard that cans of beer tumbled out and went rolling across the floor. Terry swore at her. So did the man. Having a discouraged sigh, Terry flopped down on the couch. She gestured for Julie and me to sit. "Just don't tell me you come about problems," she said wearily, "'cause there's nothing I can do. I got too many problems to deal with already. You can see that just looking around. So please don't say you're here about problems." I could sense she was telling the truth there, that she really didn't have the resources to cope with much more. I felt sympathy for her then. "Is Venus here?" I asked. "Dunno," Terry said. She was obviously tired. She rubbed her hand over her face again. "Do you suppose we could find out?" I asked. "I'd like to see Venus." Terry lifted her head and scanned around the trailer, as if perhaps she'd overlooked the child. Then she turned her head and looked back at Wanda. "Wanda, where's Venus?" Wanda ambled out of her seat. She wandered down the narrow corridor and into one of the rooms at the end of the trailer. Several moments passed in expectant silence. Julie and I had our necks craned to see where Wanda had gone. Terry leaned forward and removed a cigarette from the pack of the coffee table. She lit it and took a long, slow drag, giving a relieved-sounding sigh at the end. Wanda mingled out of the back room carrying something. As she came up to us, I could see it was the plastic doll wrapped in a receiving blanket. It had been dressed in old baby clothes. Wanda smiled shyly at me and called the doll. "Beautiful child," she said and smiled again. "Wanda," Terry cried in exasperation when she saw the doll. "Venus, you asshole. I said go get Venus, not your fucking doll." But Wanda never did get Venus. Indeed, we never managed to see Venus at all. Instead, Wanda wandered off with her doll into another part of the trailer and never returned, while I was distracted by the realization that Wanda needed intervention every bit as much as Venus. Venus returned the next day as if nothing had ever happened, so I decided to pick up where I left off. During the time before school, I'd rearrange the classroom furniture to give me a small, cubicle-like space screened off from the rest of the room. This way I could work alone with Venus without constant interference from the boys. That afternoon, after getting the boys settled with their folders and leaving Julie in charge, I took Venus around the corner of the file cabinet and into my little cubicle. I'd added a small table and 2 chairs. I sat her in one chair and positioned the other of the opposite side of the table. I sat down. I got the feeling of a faint sense of alarm from Venus when I took her into this private area, but it was just a sense. Nothing about her facial expression changed much, and she sat without a lot of encouragement, but there was a slight glance around the small area and a springly lightness to her shoulders that I was coming to recognize as the precursor to movement. She didn't move, however. Within a minute or two, she'd settled down to stone-like stillness. Opening the package of M&Ms, I took out a small handful and held them out. "Remember this? We had this day before yesterday, remember?" To look down at the candies in my hand, she only moved her eyes. I let the M&Ms spill onto the table between us with a satisfying clatter. Bright and colorful, they lay scattered across the tabletop. I left them like that for several moments and did nothing, hoping Venus might be tempted enough to take one of her own volition, or at least register an interest in them. Not so. "Candy," I said. "Do you like candy?" "Most children do." She stared at me, her face immobile as wood. "We eat them," I said. I put one in my mouth. Really sweet. Chocolate." She kept staring, and I got the feeling that she thought I'd gone stark raving mad. This made me smile and eventually laugh. "Here you have one," I said. I picked up a red M&M and put it between her lips. It hung there, so I took a finger and pushed in the rest of the way into her mouth. "Nothing." "Can you taste it?" "Nothing." "Try shaving it." Venus just sat. "Chef," I reached over and moved her chin with my hand while making exaggerated shaving moments myself. I was reminded, as I did this, of a scene from a Star Trek program where a member of the starship crew was trying to teach the fine art of eating to a woman who had spent most of her life as a sort of living machine. Not so unlike Venus. This didn't seem to have an effect, so we both just sat. The chocolate would melt in her mouth eventually, and she would taste it whether she wanted to or not. I watched her, waiting to see her swallow. Eventually she did. Nice? I asked. Do you want another? I reached over and shoved a green M&M between her lips. Venus and I spent 40 minutes doing that. During this time I passed a total of 22 M&Ms into her mouth. Nothing changed over the course of that whole time. She just stared at me as I pushed the candy into her mouth, waited for it to melt, waited for her to swallow, and pushed the next one in. She never looked down at the candies, never appeared to shove them, never tried to gather them more quickly, never ever even acknowledged they were there at all. All this time I kept up the quiet patter, largely about the taste of the candy and the sensation of eating them, but Venus responded to my words no more than she did to the M&Ms. When the bell rang to signal the end of the school day, I got up, put the candy away. She brought Venus around the corner of the cubicle to join the other children. Wanda was at the door to take Venus home. Julie churched by, trying to keep up with the boys as they raced for their buses. I beckoned to Wanda. Will you come talk to me a minute, Wanda? No talk to strangers. Have you been told that? I asked. Yes, that's a sensible rule, isn't it? But I'm not a stranger. I'm Venus' teacher. I've been to your house, remember? I came and saw you the other day after school. Wanda was carrying the baby doll wrapped in the receiving blanket again. She held it close to her chest. I'd like to talk to you about Venus. Won't you come in and sit down? No go stranger house. Here, would you like some M&Ms? I asked. It was dirty of me because I was probably undoing all the efforts to keep Wanda safe from strangers, but it did the trick. Wanda ambled into the room happily as I poured the candies on the tabletop. Is that your dolly? I asked as Wanda sat down. Beautiful child, she said and caressed the molded plastic hair. Yes, you like to take care of your doll, don't you? Beautiful child. Her no go to school. No, your dolly doesn't go to school, does she? But what about Venus? Venus goes to school, doesn't she? Beautiful child. Wanda caressed the doll again. Can you talk to me about Venus? What does Venus do when she isn't at school? Beautiful child. Here, have some more M&Ms. Unlike her sister, Wanda have no inhibitions about eating. She stuffed the candy into her mouth by the handful and chomped messily. When I came to your place the other day, where was Venus then? I didn't see her. Remember, you tried to find her. Where was Venus? Her no go to school. No, I know that. But what does she do at home? Can you tell me? Eat. Venus eats? Eat. Wanda said more insistently, and I realized she meant she wanted more candy. The package was almost empty. I pulled what was left onto the table. Wanda scrabbled it up with both hands. I looked beyond her to Venus, who stood beside the doorway. She wasn't watching us. She was just starting into space. Go home now, Wanda said when the candy was gone. Wait, I said. Go home now. She got up. Beautiful child, go home, beautiful child. She called to Venus. Before I could stop her, she was to the door and out with Venus in front of her. It was only after she'd left that I discovered the doll in its receiving blanket, forgotten on the floor. Chapter 8. I had one activity I'd always done with all my classes. Indeed, I'd use it occasionally in therapy with individual children as well. I'm sure It has some proper formal name and probably proper formal rules, but my version grew out of desperation one ran in races many years back when I was a student teacher. The children couldn't go outside to play and were wild with pent-up energy, so I decided to take them on an imaginary journey. We all sat down in a circle on the floor and closed our eyes. Then I told them to look inward, to envisage a deep-sea diving bell, because I was going to take them on an adventure trip under the sea. This worked fantastically. I had the children first imagine the diving bell, what it looked like, what was it, how it felt and smelled. Then they imagined the descent down deep into the water. Then we started looking for things, and I asked different ones to describe what they saw. If their descriptions were sparse, I queried gently to make a more complete picture. No one had to contribute, but everyone did. We stayed in the circle, our eyes closed, and wandered around under the sea for about 15 minutes. When we finally emerged back into the classroom, the children were delighted. We made pictures of it to put on the wall in the hallway and talked about our trip for a long time afterward. Indeed, for many it became the single best memory they had of my student teaching. From then on, I made imaginary journeys regularly. As I became more experienced, I knew more about what I could do on the journeys. If the children needed to relax and calm down, we visited quiet places and spent a lot of our time listening and feeling the atmosphere. If the children needed a change of scenery, as during the rainy recess, we went somewhere exotic. If the children needed cheering up, we visited a circus or a zoo or a carnival. Once we had an imaginary birthday party. At Christmas time we went to the North Pole. I found it a particularly useful activity with attention deficit children who often had a hard time calming themselves down. The act of sitting together on the floor with our eyes closed seemed to help them block out enough other stimuli so they could focus well. Thus, this seemed like it would be a useful technique for my chipmunks. I felt Jesse, in particular, would benefit. Because he suffered from Tourette's syndrome, he was often jerking and twitching involuntarily. It also caused him to make sudden noises. He didn't shout out obscenities, the Tourette's tic popularized in the media, which is actually rather rare. However, he did make a sharp yelping sound, rather like a startled bark, and he did this quite a lot. He also had a noisy, stylized sniff that went along with his facial tic, and this produced a piggy kind of noise. All considered, the others were tolerant about the tics, or at least they didn't single out the tics as a reason to fight with him. Nonetheless, the tics were disruptive and occasionally alarming if you didn't accept them. So I felt the guided journeys might be of benefit to Jess because his tics always become worse under stress. I was hoping that the journeys might provide a relaxing alternative in his day that would calm the noise and motion a little bit. I also hoped they would help Billy. My goal for him was that she develop awareness of his thoughts before he did something, so that he had a better chance of interviewing. At the moment, Billy just did and then coped with the aftermath. I was sure he wasn't even conscious there were any before thoughts affecting his actions, so constructive use of imaginary journeys seemed like a good place to start, helping him develop an understanding of thoughts as something you produced yourself and could control. Thus, Monday after morning recess, I said, "Okay, gang, we're going to do something different." Once you have your shoes off and in the box, I want you to come over here and sit down in a circle on the floor. This elicited excitement. Although somewhat uncontrolled and chaotic, this group was also enthusiastic, which made them fun to work with when they weren't killing one another. Okay, I want you sitting, but get comfortable. Shane, keep your hands to yourself, please. Venus, sit down. I had to rise up again and direct Venus into place. Zane, sit. No, sit. Everybody ready? Now we're going to take a journey. Right here, right now. And since we're chipmunks, I think we should visit the woods. Ready? All the boys nodded. Close your eyes then. Not tight. Just gently so you're comfortable. Keep them closed. Get yourself comfy. I closed my eyes too at the beginning and leaned forward, forearms on my knees. Now we're off. We're walking toward the woods. Can you see? Look ahead. I opened my eyes and checked on everyone. No, then keep your eyes shut. Look ahead inside your mind. There's the woods. See the trees. Everybody look in their minds. See if you can see the woods ahead. Can you? Yeah, Billy said enthusiastically. See if you can tell what kind of trees they are. What kind of trees are in your woods? Does anybody know? Yeah, said Billy immediately. Pine trees. You're seeing pine trees. Does everyone see pine trees? Or does someone see something different in their woods? I see the kind that's got big flat leaves, Shane said. Okay, good. Pine trees and the kind of trees that have flat leaves, the kind that lose their leaves. We call them deciduous trees. So look at your trees carefully. What kinds of trees are in your woods? I see trees with leaves and pine trees, Jess said. My forest has got them both. Yeah, me too, Billy said, not wanting his imaginary woods to be without something someone else saw. Are they tall trees? I asked. Have they got thick trunks? Look around. Do you see any young trees there too? Mine are big, Billy cried. Can you put your arm around one of them, Billy? Everybody. Go up to one of your trees and try to reach around it. Feel the bark. Feel it with your fingers. But pat your face against the tree too. You're trying to stretch your arms all the way around. Feel what it feels like. I opened my eyes again slightly to see the boys, all of them with their hands stretched out in the air, reaching to feel imaginary trees. I peeked over at Venus. She too had her eyes shut tight. She didn't have her hands up in the air like the boys did, but her fingers were splayed out of her knees and twitching slightly, as if possibly she was feeling for an imaginary tree of her own. Mine's got nobly bark, Billy cried with unexpected loudness. Quietly, Billy, I said. You scare away the animals. Nobly bark, he whispered. Yeah, mine too. I can feel it on my cheek, Jess said. What about you, Zane? What does your tree feel like? It's a pine tree. It's rough. Can you smell it? He nodded and smiled slightly, his eyes still closed. Yeah, I can smell mine, cried Billy, still a little loud. Shut up, Billy. You'll scare the animals away, Jess said. Oh, look, I said. Something's moving through the trees over there. What is it? Look carefully. Over there in the distance, going through the trees. Do you see it too? A deer, Billy positively shouted. You stupid pisser, Jess cried. You keep hollering. You scared the deer away. And before I knew what was coming, Jess punched Billy in the mouth. This, of course, rather readily pulled us all out in our imaginary visit to the woods. Not expecting to be hit, Billy burst into tears. Just got up and stamped off, twitching and yelping. Zane and Shane were on their feet, shouting, "That's not fair. They wrecked our time. We weren't done. They wrecked it. They ought to go in the quiet chair." I felt sorry for Billy, innocent victim of his own enthusiasm, because I knew he hadn't meant to wreck things. He had simply been enjoying himself and, as ever, had lost control. I gave him a cuddle and rubbed his chin, and while I could hardly condone what Jess had done, I didn't want to punish him. He too had simply been caught up in the imaginary journey. So I walked over and put an arm around him afterward, saying I was sorry Billy had disturbed things for him, and I understood how it made him feel angry, but reminding him for the millionth time that I couldn't allow hitting, and please would he try to remember that. Shane and Zane stood forlornly. "Can we do it again?" It wasn't far. They wrecked. "Please, can we do it again?" Zane asked. "Yes, we will, but not just now," I said. "We'll do it tomorrow at the same time." "No," Shane moaned. "I want to do it now. It's not far." "I know. You feel disappointed. Tomorrow we'll do it again." "Please." "Tomorrow." "This afternoon, okay?" Zane begged. "Please." "We can't this afternoon. Julie comes then, and we're getting a new girl, so we need to do other things. Tomorrow after morning recess." The twins stumped off, disgruntled, to their tables. I turned to look for Venus, and there was still sitting cross-legged on the floor, her eyes still tight shut. I regarded her. Why was she like that? Again, my first instinct was to believe she couldn't hear us, and thus had not realized we'd stopped the activity. But then, if she couldn't hear, she wouldn't have known we started the activity, or what we were doing during the activity. So why was she still sitting with her eyes closed? Did some part of her brain not register that we'd stopped? Or not want to register we'd stopped? Or was it just plain resistance? Coming over, I squatted down directly in front of her. "Venus!" No response. I was a little reluctant to touch her, in case she wasn't expecting it. "Open your eyes, Venus. We're done with the imaginary journey. We're doing something else now." Slowly, she opened her eyes. I smiled. "You stayed a little longer in the woods than the rest of us, huh?" She looked at me. I looked back at her. Her expression was so enigmatic that she could have been an alien child sitting there. That day the part-time students were due to start coming. Up until the point, we hadn't been much of a cohesive group, as scouts had always been too close at hand. However, the arrival of them other kids, as the boys chose to call them, brought out their team spirit. "They ain't gonna be chipmunks, are they?" Shane asked during morning discussion, as I prepared them for the arrival of our first new student. "No," Billy cried. "No, teacher. They can't be chipmunks. Okay? Please. 'Cause just us guys get to be chipmunks." "What do you think about that, Jess?" "Yeah, just us guys who live here." "All right then," I replied. "I think we ought to have a special signal," Billy said. "You know, something that makes us know we're chipmunks." It was said as if this were some elite society we were speaking of. Something to help us keep our spirits up when we got all these other geezers in here to put up with. "Let's go. Chip, 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 chip," Zane suggested. Don't you think that might get a little noisy? I asked. Of course, this meant all the boys had to do it. And not too discreet. What's discreet mean? Billy asked. Discreet means when you keep something kind of private and don't make a big show of it, I said. Something like a hand signal might work better. The conversation pursued this vein for several minutes, with the boys trying our various movements and gestures that they thought could serve as this special signal. I watched Venus as they talked. She was sitting at her table, as were the boys sitting each at their individual tables, as we'd not yet progressed to the point of being able to sit peaceable next to one another. Given my big, booming voice, I had no trouble being heard when the kids were scattered all over the room, and the boys' personalities were all so loud and expansive that the distance among them still helped more than it hindered. They could jump up, swing their arms around, and be their usual lively selves without crashing into anyone else. In this respect, the distance was useful for Venus too, as she did not explode unpredictably simply because someone had inadvertently invaded her space. However, it also made it easier for her to isolate herself. I could tell she was completely tuned out of this conversation. Leaning slightly forward, arms crossed on the tabletop, eyes blank and unfocused, she was as motionless as the furniture itself. And indeed, that's how the boys responded to her. Venus, for all intents and purposes, was not there. Well, what I think, Zane said, is that we should wiggle our feet, like this, 'cause we're two ones who don't got no shoes on. If you don't got shoes on, you're a chipmunk, huh? And so you can wiggle your toes. Hey, way cool, Billy cried, whipping off a grubby sock and sticking his bare foot up on the table with a toot. He wiggled his toes. Billy, remove it, I said sharply. Billy didn't take his foot down, but instead burst into a spontaneous rendition of a children's ditty. Stuck on my head in a little skunk's hole. Little skunk said, "Well, bless my soul. Take it out, take it out, take it out." Zane and Shane chimed in with him. "Remove it." One of the children coming to me for extra support was a little girl named Gwen, although anyone called her Gwynnie. Gwynnie was 8, a very attractive little girl with shiny, straight, bobbed blonde hair and unexpectedly dark eyes. She had originally been diagnosed as having HFA, which stood for High Functioning Autism. Like many autistic-type children, Gwynnie was a bright child doing well academically. Her reading skills were excellent and her math skills were good. However, social skills were another matter altogether because Gwynnie took everything literally and at face value. She could not interpret the nuances of speech, of other people's facial expressions or their behavior, nor could she understand how to adjust her own behavior to that of those around her. As a consequence, she was unpopular with the children in her class because she often said blunt, hurtful things or belched in on games or activities. The social inadequacy was further hampered by her interests. Intensely pursued special interests are common in perfectly normal children of this age group and seem to be part of a healthy developmental process. Hence, the typical collecting stage where acquiring trading cards or toys becomes a fascination for most school-age children, and for some at least momentarily a real fixation. As is typical for children with autistic tendencies, Gwynnie raised these childish obsessions to a whole different level. For example, she collected pencils. While pencils themselves weren't an unusual object of desire, and a lot of the kids collected them, particularly the pretty shiny ones or those with vivid designs or strangely shaped erasers, Gwynnie was fascinated by plain old standard issue yellow ones. She routinely carried about 20 of them around with her at any given time, and despite the fact that they all looked just alike to the rest of us, Gwynnie knew each of these pencils individually. She liked to feel and examine them regularly and to lay them out on the tabletop and then line them up in ascending order from the longest to the shortest. Every time she went into a new classroom, she insisted on knowing if there were any other yellow pencils in there and couldn't settle down until she found out if there were, and if so, how many and how well used. Each time she saw one, her little eyes just lit up. This all paled, however, compared to Gwynnie's big obsession, foraging countries. Gwynnie had acquired an encyclopedic knowledge on the subject and loved nothing better than telling you about the geography of Indonesia or the population statistics of Belgium. The problem was this was all she really wanted to talk about. When I first found out she was due to spend time in our room, I was curious because her academic skills were so good. After half an hour of listening to her, however, I quickly came to suspect it was not so much a matter of giving Gwynnie the benefits of my room as it was giving Gwynnie's teacher the benefits of a break from her. We all soon discovered just how tiring she could be. She came through the door Tuesday just after lunch. "Hello, Gwynnie," I said. "Here I'll show you where you are going to sit." The total land area of Sweden is 449,964 square kilometers. Its capital city is Stockholm, and Stockholm is also the largest city. Sweden is bordered by Norway on the north and Finland on the east. It is one of the 5 Scandinavian countries. The others are Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. The people are chiefly of Germanic ethnicity, with a few ethnic Finns. The other major cities are Gothenburg, Uppsala, Sundsvall, Östersund. Okay, Gwynnie, thank you. Would you sit here, please? Have you been to Sweden? No? Here's your folder. Have you been to France? France has 543,965 square kilometers, and the capital city is Paris. About 34% of French land is cultivated. Oh, Billy said softly under his breath. This one cuckoo. Jess raised one socked foot and wiggled his toes. As Gwynnie was going to come 3 afternoons a week, I decided that he would be an ideal partner for Venus. She and Gwynnie could work on social skills together, which even I realized was pretty much of a long shot, as both girls were virtually at nil in this department. But I felt that having two was better than my working individually with them, as they could model for each other in a way I never could. The first day I sat the two girls down together, which of course meant maneuvering Venus into position like a doll and corralling Gwynnie, who was trying to tell Jess about South Korea. I chose just about as basic as an activity as I could. I had cut out pictures from magazines and pasted them onto index cards. Each showed a person with a very definite facial expression, smiling, laughing, crying, frowning, and I collected about 4 examples of each. "Can you tell me how this girl feels?" I asked Gwynnie and showed her a picture of a girl beaming at a little puppy. Gwynnie looked at the picture. "How does she feel? Look at her face. See what her lips are doing. What does that tell you? Do you know the capital of Belize?" "Gwynnie, we aren't talking about countries just now. Look at the picture, please. What is this expression? It's a smile, isn't it? What does a smile tell us about this little girl? What does it tell us she is feeling?" Most people in Belize are Roman Catholics. Are you a Roman Catholic? Gwynnie, we aren't talking about that just now. Look at the picture, please. What does this girl's smile tell us about the way she is feeling? Gwynnie leaned forward and studied the picture intently. What does this picture tell you? Gwynnie looked up, her eyes wide. Maybe this girl's Finnish? Of course, doing this activity with Venus was even more fun. I showed her the same picture I had showed to Gwenny. "Look, see this girl?" Venus stared blankly at my face. "Down here, Venus." I reached over and gently tipped her head down enough to see the card with the picture on it. "Look, she has a puppy in her arms. And look at her face. See how her lips go up. She's smiling. She sees that puppy and she obviously likes holding him because look how much she's smiling at him. Can you make a smile for me?" Venus stared blankly at me. "Here, like this." I made an obvious smile with my own lips. "Can you do that?" "I can do that," Gwynnie interjected. "Good girl. Look at Gwynnie. She can smile. How are you feeling when you smile?" "Ill," Gwynnie replied. "You're feeling ill?" I asked with surprise. "How are you feeling?" "Ill," Gwynnie said and smiled expectantly, and I realized she was simply parroting back a response she had heard somewhere before. This was conversation as far as she was concerned. Each question had a specific, invariable answer. "Can you make a smile like that, Venus?" No response. "Here, like this." Gwynnie said and made an exaggerated smile. She leaned toward Venus. Whether Venus was about to go into attack mode or not, I couldn't discern, but she shifted in her seat when Gwynnie had suddenly moved toward her. "Not too close." Venus feels nervous when someone gets unexpectedly close. I said and put an arm out to separate the two girls. "Is she an Eskimo?" "No. Eskimos live in the Arctic. Their proper name is Inuit. It means real people. They speak more than 6 different languages." "No, Venus is American, just like you, only she doesn't always feel like talking." "Perhaps she is a Carmelite nun," Gwynnie responded earnestly. Chapter 9. The next afternoon started off badly. Billy got into a fight with a child from another class during the lunch break as was banished to the principal's office. Bob gave Billy the expected lecture and then made him sit in one of the principal's chairs, which were lined up in the hall outside Bob's office. This was where the bad kids sat until Bob told them they could return to their classroom. Billy was incensed. As ever, he couldn't see how anything that had happened was his fault, and when he came back to my room after the bell rang, his face was red with indignant anger, his voice on the edge of tears, at the unfairness of it all. Everybody hated him, everybody treated him unfairly. It was this stupid school, and why did he have to come here anyway? He wanted to go home right then. He wanted his brother. He wanted to go to school where his brother was, because then people wouldn't keep picking on him. Fortunately, Julie was there, so she could take the other kids, because I wanted to spend time alone with Billy. My gut feeling was that what he really needed was sympathy and a cuddle, and I knew if I was nice to him, it would make him cry. I wanted to spare him the humiliation of bowling in front of the others, particularly Jess, who didn't have a lot of patience with Billy anyhow. This would have worked out if I hadn't forgotten about Gwynnie. I was in the hallway with Billy when she came up the stairs. "Hi," she said cheerfully. "How come he's crying?" "None of your business," Billy snapped back. "How come he's crying? What happened? Did he fall down?" "I fell down yesterday. Look, I was on my bike and my bike fell over." She showed us two scraped knees. "Make her go away," Billy pleaded. "I got a relay bike. It came from England. England is one of... Gwynnie, could you just go on into the classroom, please? I'm talking to Billy just now." "Yeah, it's private," Billy said. Gwynnie didn't move. She just stared at us. "What's wrong with him?" she asked me, as if Billy weren't even there. "Has he got something the matter?" "Yeah, you," Billy cried and swung an arm out at her. Gwynnie wasn't as out of it as she appeared, because she quite gracefully stepped back out of his swing, and just stood there. "Gwynnie, please, Julie's waiting for you." It was no use. I gave up, opened the door, and took both Gwynnie and Billy into the classroom. Julie was only just coping. Shane and Zane had gotten into an argument about who was supposed to use the cassette recorder first, and Jess barked his nervousness. "I remember being a baby," Gwynnie suddenly announced. "I remember my mother patting me in a little chair outside." "That's nice," I said hurriedly. "Now could you find your chair it here, please?" "You too, Billy, time to start your folder. You find your chair as well." "Oh, when did my chair get lost?" he queried. "I mean, sit down in it." I was sitting in my little chair, and I saw a bird. Gwynnie said, "A bobolink. Bobolinks live in the Great Plains. Some live in Canada. The capital of Canada is Ottawa. Canada's a very big country." "Gwynnie," I pointed sternly to her chair. That's when I noticed Venus was not at her table. "Where's Venus?" I asked Julie. Julie, looking decidedly harassed, glanced around quickly. I think she went to the bathroom. "She was here. I'm sure she was here." I went over to the window. There was Venus, longing on top of her wall. I had no idea if she had ever come in from lunch or not. "We can't have this," I said. "The amount of time that kid misses because no one notices she isn't here. I'll go get her." "No," Julie said with unexpected feeling. "I'll go get her." I could hear the unspoken plea not to be left alone in charge of the others. Over the previous few days, I was becoming increasingly aware that I was expecting a bit too much of Julie. While she was experienced in the classroom, she was not a teacher and had no pretensions to be. Obviously, my room had come as a shock after her experiences as a support person to Cassie, who was hardworking, sweet-tempered, and confined to a wheelchair. So while Julie went down to the playground to charm Venus off her wall, I got everyone started on their work. Or at least she tried to charm Venus. Minutes passed, 5, 10. I glanced out the window and Julie was still down there, standing beside the wall, talking up to Venus, who appeared to be ignoring her completely. About 20 minutes later, Julie returned. She didn't say anything, but the look of defeat said it all. "I'll go get her," I said. "Everybody here is busy. They can do an activity of their choice when they're done with their folders. If you run into problems, call Bob up." I think when I said that I knew I wasn't coming back up myself, at least not for a long time. Down in the empty playground, I crossed to where Venus was sitting on the wall. "Venus, it's time for class. When you hear the bell ring, it's time to come in." No response whatsoever. She was in her glamour queen pose, reclined back with her arms behind her, supporting her white head back, eyes closed, one leg up, one leg outstretched along the wall, long hair tumbling down. "Venus," I stood below her. The wall was about 6 feet high, so it was really a very inconvenient height to bring her down from. She totally ignored me. "Venus, do you hear me? It's time to go in. It's time for class." I knew I'd crossed the Rubicon. By coming out into the playground myself to get her, I'd played into her game. The only way to make it my game was to ensure she went back with me. I couldn't back down now and give up. At the same time, I knew whatever I did had to be well gauged. If I reached for her and missed, or did not get enough of a grip, she would be over the wall onto the other side and off the way she had done the other time. I stood a moment longer, trying to figure out the best way to tackle the problem. It was difficult because the wall was taller than I was and Venus, of course, was on top of it. I didn't want to lose her, but I didn't want to hurt her either. Nor myself. Was she aware of me? This was the question that always lurked in the back of my mind. How much awareness was in this incredibly inert child? On the one hand, I felt much of it had to be within her control on some level. There was too the definite feel of a power struggle to much of her behavior, certainly during moments like this. She didn't want to come, and she was accustomed to not having to do what she didn't want. Like a possum playing dead, if she remained motionless long enough, she was left alone. On the other hand, it was such total unresponsiveness. This gave it the feel of something physical, something go globally wrong, that is was beyond her control, like brain damage or hearing loss or a very low IQ. And because I didn't know, because I hadn't encountered a child like Venus before, I was left feeling scared of doing the wrong thing. But inaction never accomplished anything. With one sudden move, I jumped up and grabbed hold of her leg with one hand and her dress with the other. She hadn't been expecting that. I quickly pulled her off balance and she came down off the wall and into my arms. Venus sprang to life then. She shrieked blue murder and fought furiously against my grip. I held on. I tried to sit down to keep her from kicking me, because, of course, being outside, she had her shoes on. Venus screamed and screamed and screamed. Teachers and children came to the windows of their classrooms. Indeed, I saw someone come out of the house across the street and peer over their fence. I wrapped my arms around her in a tight bear hug and sat down. Venus came down with a thud into my lap. She kicked and screamed and struggled. Bob galloped out of the building. "Do you need help?" "Hold on to her legs. I just want to get her controlled." Bob grabbed Venus' legs and pinned them to the asphalt. "Calm down," I said in a soft voice to her ear. Venus screamed and struggled harder. She disliked Bob holding her legs intensely and directed most of her energy there. "Calm down," I said again. "I let go when you're calm." She continued to fight fiercely. Minutes ticked by. She still screamed in a high-pitched, frantic manner. Minutes, minutes, minutes. It was hard to hang on to her. Bob grimly kept hold of her legs. My arms hurt with the tension of keeping her against me. How much worse it must have been for her. Everyone could hear us. There was an embarrassment factor I hadn't expected. Normally this was the kind of gritty activity that went on behind closed doors. I kept talking to her, almost whispering in an effort to get her attention. "Calm down. Quiet. Quiet now. I let go when you are quiet." Over and over and over again. A small eternity spun itself out over the playground. I had no idea how long we were there because I couldn't raise my arm to see my watch, but I was afraid we were going to run into recess. Would the other teachers think to take their children to a different part of the playground? I dreaded the idea of other children surrounding us, watching. Once started, I felt the need to see this through to its conclusion, particularly after the last time with Julie, when Venus had managed to fight long enough to win her freedom. This was a power struggle I needed to win if I wanted Venus to start playing the game my way. Venus went hoarse with her screaming. "Calm down," I said for the 100th time. Then suddenly she screamed, "Let go!" Bob and I exchanged surprised glances. "Calm down. I let go when you're calm." "No, no, no, no." "Yes, no screaming, quiet voice." "No, let go." So I thought she can talk. About 20 minutes passed before Venus actually did start to calm down. Exhaustion was taking over by then. She'd almost lost her voice. Her muscles quivered beneath my grasp. Indeed, mine were quivery too. "Let go," she cried one last time. "Quiet voice," I said. "Let go." It was said softly, thoughtfully. So I did. I loosened my grip and stood up. Bob let go of Venus' legs. I lifted her to her feet, but still kept hold of her wrist because I expected her to bolt. "Wow," Bob murmured as he dusted off the pants of his suit. "It's been a while since I did that." Venus was still crying, but they were child's tears. Kneeling on the asphalt, I pulled Venus against me in a hook. She cried and cried and cried. Finally, I picked Venus up in my arms and carried her into the building. We started up the stairs, but when I hit the first flight, I didn't go on up. Instead, I took her down the hall to the teacher's lounge. As I hoped, the room was empty. I went in and closed the door behind me. I set her down. Indeed, for the first time I risked letting go on her altogether. "Why don't you sit there?" I said and directed her toward the sofa. Venus did as she was told. I took money out of my pocket and put it in the top machine. I'll bet you're thirsty after all that. Hey, do you like Coke? Venus was watching me. I thought perhaps there was the slightest hint of a nod. Perhaps not. Perhaps it was only wistful thinking on my part. I picked the can out of the tray and opened it. Here. For the first time, Venus responded of her own accord. She reached out and took the Coke from me and drank deeply of it. That was hard work, wasn't it? I said and sat down across from her. I'll bet you are tired, I am. She watched me closely. Let's not have to do this again, okay? Next time the bell rings, please come in. The bell says time for school. So you need to come into the building when you hear it ring. That's the better way. I didn't like having to do it this way. Venus lowered her eyes. She regarded the can of Coke for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and placed it on the coffee table. For that brief moment, she looked like a kid. Then she sat back, let out a long, slow sigh, and the shade lowered again. I could see it happening. It was almost a physical thing passing over her. Venus went blank. Moving that Coke can was the last spontaneous movement she made for the rest of the afternoon. Chapter 10. As exhausting and traumatic as the day had been, I went home that night in a buoyant mood. Suddenly there seemed possibility. Venus could talk. Venus could respond. Now all that was left was finding a way of drawing her out, of making her want to communicate with us. But what way was this going to be? I spent the whole evening preoccupied with this question. I cast about my apartment, looking for something to stimulate her, some idea that might work, pulling out drawers from my file cabinet that contained teaching materials and work from students in years gone by. I forgot about having supper as I sat on the floor and went through folder after folder looking for inspiration. Two separate memories kept intruding as I searched. One was of the very first child I had ever worked with. Her name was Mary, and she was 4 at the time. I was a college student working as an aide in a preschool program for disadvantaged children. Mary was my first experience of elective mutism, where the individual, usually a child, is able to speak normally but refuses to do so for psychological reasons. In Mary's case, she had been badly traumatized, but what I now suspect was sexual abuse, although this was back in the days before such things were generally recognized. Whatever the etiology, she was terrified of men and spent much of her time at school hiding under the piano. I was charged with the job of developing a relationship with Mary. Like Venus, Mary had been very unresponsive to, although not to the degree Venus was. She had also refused all the staff's usual methods of involving her in classroom activities. I was inexperienced and idealistic, so I'd never considered the possibility that Mary was too damaged or had too low an IQ to respond. I'd crawled down on my hands and knees under the piano day after day, talking to her even though she never talked back, reading to her when I finally ran out of words. It was a long, slow process over many months, but in the end Mary did form a relationship with me, and eventually she did start talking again. I mulled back over the memory, reliving those long ago moments spent under that piano, that even now stood out in my mind for its unusual color. It had been splatter-painted, a zillion white points of paint on a dark turquoise background, like snowflakes against the winter twilight. That was my memory. Mary's weary eyes staring out from the turquoise-colored darkness. I had been made to feel really good about succeeding with Mary. The staff had been supportive throughout and very congratulatory when Mary finally started talking and joining in. No doubt such a positive outcome and such positive feedback put me on the path to my future career. But I remembered feeling just a bit guilty about all the attention. Why? Because the truth was I had done nothing. I had used no special techniques, no special training, no deep insights. It simply spent time with her, made it clear I was happy to spend time with her, even if we weren't doing much, even if I had many other things that were important too. And that was all it took to help Mary. The other memory that kept intruding over that evening was of a close friend of mine whose son had suffered a severe head injury at 6 as a result of being hit by a car. I remembered her using a soft bristled baby brush to brush his arms and legs as he lay comatose in the hospital bed. I couldn't quite remember what the theory behind this was, something elaborate about realigning the nerve endings that I didn't quite believe, but the idea of waking him back up to life by softly stimulating him in this way had made sense to me. Over the course of the evening, the two memories started to integrate. I'd read to Venus. I wasn't able, of course, to spend one-to-one time with her like I had with Mary, at least not during the school day, so I was going to have to do it outside class. But that was okay. I'd frequently work extra time with students, and I'd make in tactile. I wasn't quite sure how. Brushing her arms with a baby brush seemed a little over the top, or at least a little strange because I didn't suspect she had a brain injury. But I had a very strong feeling that Venus needed this kind of tactile input. Remote as she was, either physically up on her wall or emotionally sitting in my classroom, I sensed she was out of touch, in the real sense of the word, in the literal sense of the phrase. I started looking through my bookshelves for children's books. I chose a few. Then, as I was taking down folders from a higher shelf, a comic fell. I picked it up. She-Ra, Princess of Power. I wasn't quite sure how I'd acquired this particular comic. Probably taken from some child in a formal class and forgotten about. She-Ra was the sister of He-Man, who was some toy manufacturer's massively popular marketing dream in the early 1980s. Stimulated by a cartoon called The Masters of the Universe, these toys may not have actually ruled the universe, but for several years they'd come darn close in my classroom. Ever present in the form of comics, Saturday morning cartoons, and small plastic toys, He-Man, his companions, and his assortment of arch enemies had dominated my boys' free time, generated a million races games, and provoked a mania of obsessive collecting and trading. To me, He-Man had seemed a pale imitation of the old-time superheroes like Superman and Batman, copied shamelessly right down to the cowardly secret identity. Moreover, the skills of the marketing men targeting their prey irritated me. Nonetheless, while He-Man was rather one-dimensional, I found he and the other characters engaging and decent enough, and there was no denying how much the little boys in my classroom loved following the adventures or acting them out on the playground. As a consequence, I'd lived peaceable with He-Man when he was at the height of his popularity and had become as conversant in the details of his life and that of his followers and their arch enemy, Skeletor, as any gossip columnist following the private lives of the stars. On the other hand, I had remained rather more dismissive of She-Ra, He-Man's sister, as she seemed a little too transparent an effort to cash in on little girls, given that the toy manufacturers had already captured the hearts, minds and pocket money of little boys. An exact replica of her brother in female form, secret identity, arch enemies, and superpower in the form of a magic sword, She-Ra had never really caught on in my classes the way He-Man had anyway. My girls had all been My Little Pony addicts in that era. I opened the comic and paged through it. There was a momentary sense of nostalgia as I saw the old familiar Masters of the Universe names. These characters had once been such a part of daily life, and now I hadn't brought them to mind in years. The memories filled me with the sensation of warm sun, that smell of sun of linoleum, that baking feel of sun through glass, all I suppose because the year Masters of the Universe was all its height was also the year I taught in a classroom with huge windows facing west. So maybe it was simply a sense of old times' sake that made me put the comic in with the books I was going to bring to Venus. Gwynnie, we were discovering, was very badly bothered by sudden noises. This was particularly unfortunate because of just sudden, frequent bar-like sounds. Gwynnie, in response, would clamp her hands over her ears. "Tell that boy to stop," she demanded one afternoon. "I'm sorry it's bothering you, Gwenny," I said, "but it isn't a noise Jess can help making." She couldn't scream it out. Hands over her ears, she rocked back and forth. "Julie," I asked, "could you take Gwynnie out in the hallway to work? Maybe for now that'll help." I went to work with Jess, with Julie, and Gwynnie went out of the room. Jess seemed to be going through a stressful period because his twitches and noises had become much worse over the previous few days. I was making a mental note to phone his grandmother and find out how things were at home when an explosion of sound came from the hallway. Getting up, I went out to see. Gwynnie was having a full-blown tantrum. I didn't know what had set it off. Possibly she'd simply had too much sensory input and couldn't keep herself together any longer. Whatever, she had thrown herself down on the floor, kicking and screaming like a 2-year-old. "Get her up," I said to Julie. "Bring her inside." Julie hovered, either uncertain or unwilling to grab hold of her. I stepped in and grabbed Gwynnie's arm. "Come on, sweetie. We can't do this here. It makes too much noise." She didn't want to be touched. I discovered Gwynnie was very sensitive to most stimuli, whether auditory, visual, or kinesthetic, and today she'd clearly just had it, but I needed to move her out of the hallway because her screaming would disrupt other classes. Even as it was, I could hear classroom doors closing up and down the hall. So I half pulled, half dragged her into the room and over across to the reading corner. "You sit here for a while. Look, here's the picture book of Germany. Remember this one, Gwynnie? When you are feeling better, you can have quiet time and look at it for a while. She was too out of control to care, so I left her screaming on the rug. Queenie wasn't inclined to tantrums, but when she had one, it was a doozy. She was in a rather awkward position, on her knees with her bottom up but bent forward so that her forehead was on the floor rather like the Muslim prayer position, and she had her hands clasped over her head. She screamed and screamed. The kids all hated it, understandably, and several of them sat with their hands over their ears. Julie clearly hated it too. She moved nervously around. "Shouldn't we be doing something for her?" she asked. "Should I try to hold her?" I shook my head. No, I think she'd had too much stimulation. She was probably already wound up when she arrived. I couldn't cope with the added noise in here. Some children with autistic-type problems often find sensory stimuli more intense than average. Noises sound louder, smells are stronger, same for touch, so I didn't think she'd want to be touched at that point. She just needed to let off steam. "Why don't you work with Zen instead?" I suggested. "You could do math flashcards." After recess we were going to do cooking. This was an activity that I often used in my classrooms. Sit-in could be used to teach math and reading, as well as patience, something few of my children had enough of. The added benefit was that virtually all the children enjoyed cooking. It was a freer and friendlier form of learning, and food is a powerful motivator. I didn't think I'd better try anything to elaborate with this bunch, at least not during these early days, so I baked some cupcakes at home and brought them in. All we were going to do was make in the icing. Then the children would ice the cupcake and decorate it. We planned to view all the finished result and then, of course, eat them. I thought it went relatively well, given this particular group and their normal behavior. Zane did smash one cupcake in anger when he couldn't get the icing to go on the way he wanted. And Jess did push one into Billy's face, and they fell to fighting on the floor, but then Jess and Billy would probably have fallen to fighting at some point, whatever we chose to do. I helped Gwynnie back into the group. She was still feeling a little fragile and did not want anyone to be anywhere near her or even look at her cupcake, but she did manage to get icing onto it before slinking off into the reading corner to devour it. Julie was assigned to Venus. Of this, of course, was its own usual hustle. Venus had to be guided to the table, her hand lifted to take the icing knife, her other hand guided to take the cupcake. "No," I said, noticing Julie struggling. "Don't let her get away with moving back. Make her join. Stand behind her so she can't back off. Then just take her hand and do it." I wasn't sure whether, after coping unsuccessfully with Gwynnie, Julie was afraid that she might set Venus off her, whether she disagreed with forcing Venus to participate, but she seemed very hesitant. It was hard to know with Julie. She was hesitant about everything that involved pushing the children to do something. She was not an imitator, nor, I discovered, was she very good at standing her own ground in the face of noisy opposition from one of the kids. But we were coping. While our styles were very different, I was so grateful for Julie's help in the classroom that I could live with the difference. With children like Venus and Gwynnie, who needed instant one-to-one attention on occasion, it was invaluable having another adult present. We survived cooking, and for the most part, the kids loved the activity. When the afternoon came to an end, I was quite pleased. I had been a tiring day, but despite the various upsets, I felt like I'd stayed on top of everything and we'd ended the day in a reasonably cheerful, upbeat mood. I took the kids down to their buses and returned to the room. While I was down at the buses, Julie had endeavored to clean up the room in the aftermath of the cooking activity. She had the back sink full of soapy water and dirty dishes. "Hey, don't bother with that," I said. "We just put them in that cardboard box over there, and I'll take everything home and put them in the dishwasher." It was an innocent remark made because I didn't want to see her working so hard on something that didn't really need doing. I was well aware by that point that Julie, like Gwynnie, had just about had it with the day. And as with Gwynnie, an innocent remark proved to be the straw that broke the camel's back. That was an extended moment when the muscles of Julie's face pulled tight and we stood frozen, all her concentration focused on keeping control. It was one of those odd slow-motion moments because it felt long even though I knew it was short. I was aware of her expression, aware of what was happening, but not able to react fast enough to do anything helpful. Julia threw the paper towel down into the sink and left the room. I went after her. She didn't go far. She stood just outside the door, taking deep, noisy inhalations to keep herself from crying. "Hey, kiddo," I said, and that proved too much for her. She dropped her head and dissolved into tears. I reached out and put an arm around her shoulders. "Come on back in the room." Back at the table in the middle, where we usually did our after-school work, Julie flopped down. I lifted over the box of tissues and then sat down myself across from her. "I can do this," she said. This made her cry in earnest again. She'd had her elbow on the table, hand bracing her cheek, but she opened her hand to cover her face and turned slightly away from me. "No, I think you're doing fine," I said softly. "It was just a bad day." Julie shook her head. "No, I can't do this. I thought I could. I thought I'd like it, but I hate it." "It was just a bad day," I said. "They're all bad days for me, Torey. I can't do this. I can't be what you expect of me." "No, I'm not expecting, Julie. You're doing well. I'm happy with how you are in here. You are expecting. Maybe you don't know you are, but you are. You expect me to be as good as you. You expect me to be you. And I can't be." I'd been aware there were problems. I knew Julie found the daily rough and tumble a little too rough and tumbly sometimes. And true, I was aware of relying on her more than she was really trained for. But I had no awareness of expecting her to be me, as she put it. This took me a bit aback because this sounded very much like the words that come right before I quit. "What do I do that makes you feel this way? You want me to be you? In that way?" She snuffled and wiped her eyes with her fingers. "You want me to think like you. You want me to do things your way. If I don't, if I fail, I feel scared to fail because then I know you're going to be thinking if she'd done it my way." "That's not really what I'm thinking at all, Julie. If you fail, what I'm going to be thinking is, how can we get this sorted out?" Julie didn't respond. She wiped her eyes again. Unfortunately, as I considered what Julie said, I realized it was partly true. I did find her permissive attitude toward the children out of sync with my philosophy, and when she got herself into trouble, I was sometimes aware of thinking that maybe now she'd see the value of my approach. So yes, there probably was an element of that. But they were normal kinds of thoughts, natural thoughts, that come up whenever there are different points of view. There'd never been any intentional control, freakery involved. The awful aspect of this discussion was that Julie was not saying she found it hard to cope with the kids. She was saying she found it hard to cope with me. This made me feel guilty and unexpectedly defensive. "What do you think would help?" I asked. "Nothing," she said pessimistically. This brought the tears back. She struggled with them a moment, the masks of her face taut. Watching her, I was distracted yet again by the thought of how young she looked. She could have been 15 or 16 from her appearance. I was overcome with an urge to ask her how old she was, which was hardly appropriate every moment, but it led me to ponder how difficult it must be to establish any type of credible authority when you looked like a teenager. With kids or adults, it also occurred to me that such youthfulness brought out a maternal response in me. I wanted to give her a hug and tell her I'd make it better. I didn't really want to say maybe she was more right than I was and we'd try it her way. "This is a lot different from working for Casey Muldrow," she said in a very heartfelt way. "Yes, I'm sure it is. And I'm sorry for my part of this. I've been expecting too much out of you," I said. "I shouldn't have done it. It's not your fault, it's me. I thought this would be fun. I thought it'd be an interesting challenge because I thought I was ready for something more challenging." Her words trailed off. "I've been acting like this in your field and you're fully trained," I said. "Which is my mistake, not yours. You're doing all right. I'm happy with what you are doing. I know it looks like Chaos City in here most days, but really we're doing well. The boys are coming together." She dropped her head down and braced it on her hand. "And listen, I'm aware we have different philosophies," I said. "We have different approaches. That's not a bad thing. Certainly it's something I can live with, so I don't mean to make you feel that you should change." Julie reached over for a tissue, took it, blew her nose. "Yeah, okay," she said. She gave a long sigh and then shrugged. "I guess it's just been a bad day." I nodded. "I didn't mean to lose it. That's probably the last thing you need. First the kids, then me." "Don't worry about it," I said. "Yeah, well, it's probably just me." She rose from the table. "Anyway, I think I'm going to go home. I've had it for today." "Okay." I really would have preferred she stayed. She was still clearly upset, and I knew she'd be in tears again once she got to her car or wherever. I would have preferred us to have talked until everything was hashed out between us and we ended up with, if not agreement, then at least a companionable understanding in our differences. I had to accept, however, that I was probably not someone she wanted comfort from, at least not at that moment. Indeed, I was probably who she wanted to get away from. Julie picked up her things and left. I sat glumly. Oh well, at least she hadn't mentioned quitting. Chapter 11. Hell broke out 2 days later. It was over the lunch hour, and I actually wasn't at school at the time. I had a friend teaching at another school nearby, and it was her birthday, so I'd popped out to join her for a celebratory double cheeseburger at Burger King. I was only gone 30 minutes of my 45-minute lunch hour, But when I pulled my car back into the parking lot, I was greeted by the sight of an ambulance and a great furor on the playground. Given the rush of people toward me when I got out of my car, I had no trouble discerning one of my kids was involved. And of course, it took no great genius to guess it was Venus. The details leading up to the event still weren't clear, but apparently Venus had gone into one of her rages and taken after a little boy in the first grade. He fled to the climbing bars for safety with Venus in hot pursuit. In his haste, he missed one of the bars, fell off, broke his arm, and hit his head. To say the school staff were in an uproar was a vast understatement. Complacent as Bob normally was, on this occasion he had gone absolutely ballistic. It came from fear mostly, I think because the little boy was from a fairly well-to-do family, the kind to know lawyers personally, and Bob's first thoughts were of a lawsuit. That child has to go. He was crying. We cannot keep her here. She's dangerous. She's going to kill sooner or later, and she just can't be here. The playground aides were in a panic. The little boy's first grade teacher was angry to the point of shouting at me, as if my being off the school grounds was the sole reason this had happened, and I was personally responsible. I should have been controlling her, the teacher yelled. Venus had been taken inside. She was still screaming. I could hear her through the doors, through the partition of the office, through the walls. I moved past the people on the playground to go into her, but Bob put a hand out and touched my arm. No, he said, don't bother. I looked at him. Just leave her. Go on up to your room. What do you mean? She's not going back into your class. She's done here. We've called her mother, Bob said, so just go up to the kids you've got. But he shook his head. No, this was an incident too far. She can go on homeschooling or, I don't know. Frankly, I don't care. As long as she's out of here. His eyes met mine. There was a small pause, and then he shrugged. Anyway, your kids are all upstairs waiting, so it's best if you just go on up. I was in a state of shock. It had all happened so fast. Before lunch, Venus was part of the class. After lunch, she was gone. The boys were sitting wide-eyed. Julie hadn't even made an effort to occupy them. Probably she couldn't have if she tried, as the hubbub down on the playground was too much to ignore. Man, what did I tell you? Billy shouted as I came through the door. Said Psycho was gonna kill somebody someday, huh? I said that, didn't I? I was right. Billy, sit down, please. I replied and took off my coat. Everybody, find your seats. Mine's not lost, Billy piped up. I shot him the evil eye. I'm not having a good day. It would not take much for me to feel very angry, Billy. Billy put his head down between his shoulders. So what's going to happen? Jess asked. I knew he meant Venus. Okay, look, guys, come here. Pull your chairs over into a cycle right here. Because I know you've probably got lots of feelings about what just happened out there and lots of questions, so let's have a talk about it, okay? Just then, Gwynnie arrived. Gwynnie, you too, I said. We're going to start the afternoon with a discussion instead of what we normally do. Yeah, we're going to discuss how Psycho Girl killed some poor kid in the first grade, Billy added. For this group they were pretty cooperative. I didn't make the cycle too close, so as not to infringe on anyone's personal space, but I did get them to put their chairs in a semicircle in the middle of the room. The first time I tried such a thing with them, and no one immediately committed mayhem. I put Julie between Billy and Jess. Indeed, I sat on the other side of Billy with the hopes that between Julie and me we could keep him halfway restrained. Gwynnie did not like this change in her routine. She was the hardest to settle. "Gwynnie, sit down, please." She sat, but within 2 seconds she was on her feet again. "Gwynnie, sit down, please." "It's time to do programs, time to do my folder. Today we're doing it a little differently. Then we'll do folders. Sit down, please." She sat, but within 2 seconds she was again on her feet. "Geese, sit down, would you?" Billy squawked. "Who says you're the boss?" Shane muttered and half rose out of his chair. I sliced my hand through the air meaningfully. Shane sat immediately. Gwynnie eyed me a long moment, but then she sat too. "Okay, good, thank you. Now," I said, "I know what just happened is scary." "It's not scary, it's exciting," Billy shouted and shot off his chair, punching his fist like a boxer. "Psycho girl kills a first-grade baby. Pow, bang." "Shut up!" Jesse screamed, and in a second he was off his chair and onto Billy, knocking him to the floor, pummeling him. "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! You dickhead blabbermouth! I wanna stop hearing your voice all the time." At this degeneration into fisticuffs, Julie's shoulders surged. She looked at me, and there was defeat in her expression. I have to admit I was sort of short of spirit myself at that point. "Boys, I didn't bother to get off my chair." For just that moment I felt, well, if they wanted to slug it out. "Boys." The two grappled a minute or more on the floor, but my lack of intervention seemed to perplex them. There was hesitation. Billy glanced in my direction. Jess took advantage of Billy's moment of inattention to pin him to the floor. "Are you quite finished?" I asked. Jess was sitting astride Billy's back. Billy started to cry when he found he couldn't get up. I said, "Are you quite finished?" Jess looked over. He nodded and started to rise. "I just wanted him to shut up," Jess replied. "Yes, I know how you feel," I said, "but that's now how you do it." Billy was indignant. "You're supposed to be protecting me," he snuffled, "not letting some bad-ass black kid beat me up. She's supposed to be shutting you up for once." Jesse retorted. "Sit down. Billy, sit in your chair and be quiet. Jess, you too." Both boys did as they were told. Now how long did I have before the next outburst? 30 seconds? "Who saw what happened out on the playground?" I asked. "Me," said Shane. "Me too," Zane said. I did. Call on me, teacher." Billy was jumping up out of his chair, waving his hand about 6 inches from my eyes. Jess was eyeing Billy. I eyed Jess. "Did you see Jess?" He nodded. "What happened?" "That girl. She has a name, Jess. She's been a part of our class every day since school started, so let's call her by her name." "Doesn't matter anyway," Billy interjected, "'cause she ain't coming back. I heard Mr. Christensen said she's gonna have to go on homebound." I went on homebound. Last year. It sucks. 'Cause like you can't do anything except stay at home. And my brother said I was lucky. We wanted to stay at home all the time. "Jess," I asked, craning around Billy, who was out of his chair and standing right in front of me. He shrugged. "Just what she always does. kinda walking around on the playground looking mean. And then this kid comes up. Guess he must be bumped her or something. Dunno, wasn't watching. Then she just got chasing him and kept chasing him till he got up to the top of the monkey bars, and then she pulled him off. Like I said, she was just doing what she always does, beating kids up. Well, me, I'm glad she's gone, Billy said with feeling. I'm glad Mr. Christensen's making her go away. 'Cause she was psycho, even if you said she wasn't. I didn't like her in our class. Would you want someone to talk about you like that, Billy, if you had to go away? I asked. Well, if I was psycho like her, yeah, I wouldn't mind. She was a bad teacher. You were pretending she was ordinary all the time, but you weren't a kid. If you were a kid, you would have knew she was bad. After school, I was putting away things from my briefcase and came across the children's books and the She-Ra comic I'd brought it in for Venus. So that's it, I thought. End of that. I felt sad. It had ended before it even had a chance to get started. But that's how it went sometimes. I put the two books on the reading shelf for the other children. The comic, I could see no point in keeping it. The character was out of date and not too exciting to start with. None of the kids would be interested. I leaned forward and pitched it toward the trash can sitting beside my desk. It fell in with a thump. So we picked up and carried on without Venus. School had been in session almost 8 weeks by this point, so I concentrated on bringing this little band of renegades closer together, mainly, if true be known, so that I could get shoes back on them before the cold weather set in, because we were still at the stage of needing to remove shoes every time they came into the class. I found a sense of unity was one of the most crucial aspects of my type of milieu and a key to my success in working with this sort of children. For many of them, particularly those who came with histories of disruptive, antisocial behavior, it was their first experience of belonging, of being part of any kind of positive, cohesive group. Once they felt this sense of belonging, the children often behaved better and demonstrated higher self-esteem that I could have inspired on my own. So I felt it was important to achieve this group identity. The challenge each autumn was how. In the normal course of things, 8 weeks was more than enough time to settle a class in. During this period, the children became accustomed to me and to the limits I set, to my force of discipline, my expectations at the kind of work I gave out, and I became used to the dynamics of the group and how each person in it functioned. So by the end of this time, I expected all the kids to have a sense of the class as us, to feel a part of it and to find safety and security in knowing its rules. However, with this group, it wasn't quite as simple as it had been in other years. 8 weeks in and we were still without shoes, still sitting in tables at opposite corners of the room, and still routinely degenerating into fistfights. The Chipmunk Society was a small help. The boys had developed a good sense of us in contrast to the other kids who spent time in our room, including, unfortunately, Gwynnie, who spent enough time with us to be a part of the main class, but they had it only as in us versus them, which wasn't really the idea. They liked wiggling their toes at the another, but they did it more to express antisocial feelings toward the part-time kids than as a show of unity. Consequently, I arrived one morning with a big wooden box they had used in previous classrooms. In those days, It had been the kobold's box, and I often made up stories for the kids about the kobold, a little invisible gremlin who lived in our classroom and watched out for good behavior. When he saw someone behaving well, he wrote a little note describing the kindness and put it in the end kobold's box. But because the kobold soon got writer's cramp from so much good behavior, he needed help. So I asked for the children themselves to be on the lookout for kind behavior, and when they saw it, to write notes and pass them in the kobold's box. This seemed a little cheesy for my rough and tumble group, so I told them it was the chipmunk spy box. We're going to do something different, I said during morning discussion. We're going to see who's the best secret agent in this group. You mean like James Bond? Billy shouted. This called for instantly jumping out of his seat and up on top of the table. He pointed his finger like a gun and made shooting noises. Of course, this meant the other boys had to join in. I stood there and said nothing. This would eventually annoy them into sitting back down to find out what I was going to say next. So I explained the plan to them. At the beginning of the week, they would draw names to find out who their intended victim was. Then each they had to do something nice for that person, a good deed, and this was a big but, they were secret agents. So they had to do it secretly, so the other person didn't know it was them. And at the end of the week, we tried to guess who our secret agent was. I explained that each day the secret agent would have to come to me to confirm he had done a good deed. Then he'd write down what he had done for his victim and put it in the box. I said at the end of the week I'd read each of them out. To add a bit of gusto to the proceedings, I told them we'd have threads of Friday while we were doing the box, and the people who had managed to do a good deed every day for their victim would get a spy badge. I also suggested that if they wanted to be extra clever at being a secret agent, they could be good deeds for other people too, and that way they'd throw their victim off the scent. It wasn't as straightforward as doing the kobold's box. Indeed, all this secret agent business was rather complex, but that, I suspect, was what appealed to the boys. They were of the age to want to be in gangs and clubs, but they didn't have the social skills to smooth the way. So activities that involved lots of rules to be learned and challenges to master were very popular. What about Greenie? Jess suddenly asked. What about Greenie? I replied. Is she going to get included? What do you think? I asked. Well, she's not going to do it. If she's someone's secret agent, they won't get no nice things done for them. But she's part of the group, I said. Just in the afternoons, Shane said. So she ain't a chipmunk. Not really. We never said nothing about no girl chipmunks. What about Venus? She was a girl, I said. She was a chipmunk. Venus ain't here no more, so don't count, Shane said. Besides, Billy added, if we counted Greenie, I'd be an odd number. This is only going to work if there's an even number of us. But it would be Friday afternoon when we do the box and have treats. Greenie is here on Friday afternoons, I said. It wouldn't be fair not to include her. But she won't do it, Zane said. She'd forget. That person would get no secret stuff done to them. I raised my eyebrows in an exaggerated expression of perplexity. Perhaps we better not do it if we can't include Greenie. Perhaps it was a bad idea. No, wait, Billy cried. We want to do it. What do you think we should do then? I asked. The boys looked at one another. Billy shrugged. Jess shrugged. This made the twins shrug in unison. I stood silent and waited. Just leave her out, Shane said finally. I can't do that. We have to come up with something that includes everybody. Shane shrugged again. Again, there was a complete round of shrugs. Maybe you could do Gwynnie's part, Jess said at last. Yeah, Billy cried. Good idea, Jess. Teacher can do Gwynnie's part. Would that work? I asked. Yeah, Shane said. Zane nodded. Okay, I said. Whoever Gwynnie's person is, I'll give her a hand. Oh, cool, Billy cried. A secret agent teacher. Chapter 12. The week before Halloween, we had a visit from Ben Avery, the school psychologist. As part of a district-wide assessment and placement program, he was giving achievement tests plus the WISC IQ test to all special education students in restricted placements, which included the children in my class. So this meant Ben was with us for 4 days. For the most part, I wasn't in favor of all this testing. The accuracy was affected by so many things, such as cultural differences or socio-economic factors, that they seemed a waste of time. I would have much preferred someone of Ben's caliber contributing to the classroom environment for 4 days rather than closeting himself away with standardized tests. But it wasn't my choice, so one by one he took the kids away. The first 2 days were spent on Shane and Zane, and the results were, sadly, pretty much what I expected. Shane scored an IQ of 71 and Zane a score of 69, both right on the borderline of mental retardation. Both had severe reading problems. Indeed, Zane was still at the pre-reading stage of identifying shapes and letters. Shane was only just beginning to recognize of the alphabet and a few simple words. Their math was a little better, but only just. Ben spent a lot of time with me afterward, discussing the wisdom of changing them over to a class for mildly mentally handicapped children, because he thought this might meet their needs better, except for their difficult behavior. In the end, I felt they were better staying with me. Jess and Billy, who both came out of seriously deprived socio-economic backgrounds, were not doing much better academically, so Shane and Zane were not dragging down what I could do in the class. The next day was Jess' turn, and he, in fact, did better than I'd expected. He scored a full-scale IQ of 109, which was average. This was in contrast to his reading skills. The reading achievement test put him at a low first grade level, which was close to where he was working in class. Ben's other tests revealed serious weakness in auditory processing and visual integration, so Ben and I talked a long time that afternoon about learning disabilities and about how Jess' Tourette's syndrome might be affecting his academic skills. I thought I would try to concentrate more on finding ways to make learning easier for Jess. I'd done quite a lot of work with learning disabilities early in my career, so I decided to go home and check what materials I might have to help me assess what kind of learner he was and which of his senses were stronger. That way I hope to bring his academic skills up closer to his ability level. As usual, Billy turned out to be the goat among the sheep. "You're not going to believe this," Ben said when he came into my room after school the next day. Julia and I were sitting at one of the tables making lesson plans. We both looked up. Ben pitched Billy's WISC test, frisbee style, toward us. It spun in smooth circles the 6 or more feet until I caught it between my hands. I turned the paper over and laid it on the table. Verbal score 145. Performance score 142. Full scale IQ 142. You're kidding, I said when I saw it. Knowing Billy, he probably cheated, Julie said. Well, I didn't see any creep notes up his sleeve, Ben replied. Nothing written on his palm saying the definition of catacomb is catacomb, but Julie and I said in unison. This can't be our Billy, Julie said. I don't think he's ever completed a worksheet since he arrived. Ben said, this kid has definitely hidden his talents. I was thinking more along the lines of alien abduction. Pulling the WISC score sheet over in front of me, I read it. A big surprise, certainly, especially from a boy who was behind in everything and had never shown any academic inclinations whatsoever. But the more I thought about it, it did explain a lot. We just hadn't noticed it because that wasn't what we were looking for. The days passed. Then the weeks. Halloween came and it was celebrated with gusto in our room. Everyone wore their costumes, except for Gwynnie, who hated it all. Shane came as Spider-Man and Zane came as what I suppose one would call Spider-Man 2, as he had exactly the same costume. Jess's grandmother had made him a rather sweet black and white dog costume, and he arrived with long, floppy black ears attached to a headband and a shiny black nose painted over his own nose. I thought he was supposed to be the cartoon character Snoopy and praised his idea only to be told indignantly, no, he was just a dog. Billy opted for typecasting and came dressed as a red devil. Wild as the kids still were, I didn't dare have a proper Halloween party like other classes were having. Instead, I made up little goodie bags of candy, and we had cookies and punch right after the afternoon recess. Even so, it was more chaos than fun. Because the kids were overexcited by the change in routine, there were lots of fights, crying, shouting, screaming, and quiet chair time, and Gwynnie threw up on the rug in the reading corner because she ate too much candy. Nonetheless, I was glad we did it. We would have felt we'd missed out if we hadn't. Then came November with its long, grey, overcast days and cold, gusty winds. Venus never really left my mind during all this time. I kept checking the wall along the playground, half expecting to see her there, and half hoping, but I didn't. She had vanished as completely as if she'd been nothing more than a mirage I'd seen when I'd arrived at school that first day. Two of her brothers continued to attend the school. They were both in upper grades and both receiving extensive learning support, so I'd doubt a bit in the teacher's slang when the learning support teacher, Mary McKenna, was there. I didn't know Mary very well. She hadn't been part of the district team when I'd been an internet learning support teacher. She was an older woman who gave the impression of being competent and efficient, and she was friendly enough, but not openly so. Consequently, I found it hard to drop questions about Venus naturally into conversation with her. Moreover, I was self-conscious when Bob was in the room, because Bob knew immediately what I was doing. Mary doesn't have Venus, Bob said to me out in the hallway, after overhearing me one afternoon. No, I know, I was just... Venus has a special homebound teacher, someone from District 8. Homebound is all she does. I nodded. There was a pause. I was just wondering how she was doing. Wondering if her brothers had maybe said anything. Have you heard any news? Bob shook his head. Nothing about how she's getting on. If she's talking, or anything. Bob shook his head again. Then he clapped my shoulder in a reassuring, almost fatherly way. Well, we weren't ever going to get very far with her anyway. How do you mean? I asked. She shrugged. Too slow, too many family problems, you know. Life's crapped on her, so we really shouldn't worry about her. No, I mean we win some, we lose some. You have to take that attitude with some kids. Some things you can't change, so when it goes out of your hands, you just have to believe it was for the best. I smiled faintly at the irony. We've come a long way, haven't we? And you and I, from where we started. Bob knew instantly I was referring back to those heady, idealistic days together early in our careers, when there were no hopeless kids. Are you saying, have I grown up? He asked. Because, if so, Torey, yes, I have. I've been around long enough now to know, to really comprehend, that you do win some and you lose some. And you have to go with those you win and, sadly, let go of those you lose. I nodded. It's sad, I know, but it's also life. I couldn't refute him on that. There had been kids in couldn't help, ones I had to give up on. There'd been plenty of them, and I too had to reconcile the better world I wanted with the real world I had. Nonetheless, I still didn't like being forced to give up on ones I hadn't yet given up on myself. Another pause wandered into the conversation and stayed. Bob started to turn away to go back to his office. Beautiful child, I murmured. Huh? Bob turned back toward me. I said, beautiful child, thinking of the irony of it. That's what Wanda always calls her, beautiful child. When, in fact, Venus is one of the least beautiful children I've ever seen, nothing. That kid has nothing beautiful going for her, but all the time, Wanda calls her beautiful child. Well, to Wanda, she probably is, Bob replied. He hesitated a moment. You know that's true about them, don't you? He said. I looked up. It's off the record, but it's true. At least that's what social services say. What? Terry isn't Venus' mother. It's actually Wanda. Terry's last partner, the one before the greasy character she's got now, we knocked Wanda up. Oh, geez. It made horrible sense. Bob pursed his lips. This guy didn't even get done for it. Knocked up a retarded 13-year-old, and then he just waltzed off. Oh, geez. Bob made a small, defeated sound. Beautiful child, indeed. My head was going off like a popcorn popper by the time I got back to my classroom. Suddenly, many other things were making sense. If Venus was Wanda's child, what if Wanda had been left with primary care of Venus in her infancy and early childhood? Even if Venus' IQ was not affected, what kind of environment would she have been brought up in? It would be very questionable that someone of Wanda's limited abilities could provide adequate stimulation for a baby and certainly not adequate care. I remembered Wanda with her baby doll, held carelessly, loved one moment, then forgotten and left behind the next, when something else distracted her. What if Venus had spent her early years treated like this? There may have been very little stimulation, especially verbal stimulation. Perhaps she was left alone in a creep of playpen until Wanda remembered her. Perhaps she had cried so long that it finally occurred to her that crying did no good, that one simply waited, immobile, like the babies in third world orphanages with their blank faces and still bodies. What if the only time the other family members interacted with her was to cloud her into silence? Hence she learned that the defense was the best offense, so she attacked before anyone could attack her. All supposition on my part, but it fell into place like some horrible jigsaw puzzle. The chipmunk spy idea wasn't what one would call successful. The first problem was that Shane and Zane had such poor reading skills that they could do none of this by themselves. They had to have Julie help them read in who their victims were, which made it hard to keep things secret, and they needed help writing our notes to put in the spy box. Then there was the small matter of the boys liking the idea of being a spy, and even more liking the idea of treats on Friday afternoon, but no one actually liking the idea of doing good deeds. I could tell things weren't working out. On the very first day, I kept saying, "Have you done your good deed today?" And everybody nodded and said, "Yes." So I reminded them that they had to get Julie or me to confirm it, and the only one who had was Jess. He was secret spy to Zane, and his good deed had been to pick up Zane's worksheet paper, which he found on the floor, and put it back on Zane's table. Not exactly a gold-hearted act, but it was a start. On Tuesday, Jess again came to me. This time he said he'd lent Zane the colored markers during art. I hesitated to point out what I had told him to share the markers because he had locked the whole box on his desk, and when I did, all the boys had taken some, not just Zane. I also saw Billy put a note in the box. "Billy," I said, "be sure to confirm your good deed with Julie or me, so we know you did it." "I did it," he replied indignantly. "Don't you trust me?" "Fucking place, we got no trust here. How do you expect us to do anything if you never trust us?" I put a finger to my lip. "Watch your words, please. See? You don't even trust me to talk." Given his brilliant mood, I didn't persist with interrogating him about good deeds. Friday came. The evening before, I'd made gingerbread men, great big ones with each child's name on them, and I brought them in for the spy box threat. I also made a very snazzy spy badge for the winner. Everyone got extremely excited when they saw the gingerbread men. All morning the boys drooled over them, identifying which one had their name on it. Indeed, the gingerbread man proved so much of a distraction in the morning, they had to hide them in the cupboard. When the end of the day arrived, I had everyone sit down at their tables. I piled the gingerbread man on my desk and then made a big deal of bringing the spy box over to the middle table and opening it up. "What do you think we're going to find?" I asked with over-exaggerated anticipation. Billy was getting into a fervor already. He wanted to short-circuit all this talk and go straight for the gingerbread man. I opened the box. There was only a handful of notes inside, 9 to be exact. The 5 I had written on Gwynnie's behalf for Shane, who was her person. Just 2 notes for Zane and 2 entirely blank pieces of paper. "Ah," I said, "not much in here." I read out the ones I'd done on Gwynnie's behalf for Shane. "I got the most. I got the most." Shane cried, "Where's my threat?" That's not actually the way it works, I said. We get the trees for having done the good deeds, but there haven't been very many done. But I got the most, Shane yelled. I want my treat. Hold on a minute. You didn't write any, Shane. Shane burst into tears. But I won. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what we were doing. Zane peeped up. What about me? Jess cried. I done the most good deeds. I get a treat. I should get all of them. And the badge too. That's mine. I won it fair and square. You did too. And what's this blank piece of paper? Billy? Why did you put that in here? Teacher, Billy shrieked in response and pointed. Look what she's doing. I whirled around to see Gwynnie standing by my desk where had sat the gingerbread man. She was biting the legs of each one fast as she could. Teacher! Billy screamed, and before I could stop him, he was out of his seat, shooting toward Gwynnie. I intercepted him but could not catch all the boys. Julie bolted into the fray too, but it was too late. Jess picked up the single whole cookie that remained, which happened to say Zane on it. That's mine! Zane shrieked and ran toward him. I won, and I'm not eating anything with that girl's cookies on it. Jess replied and crammed the whole cookie into his mouth with a massive showing motion. Within seconds, everyone was in one big writhing, fighting, crying tangle on the floor. I pulled them apart, at least I tried to. Jess was choking over his cookie because he'd been knocked to the floor because he had time to swallow. Gwynnie was shrieking in the usual high-pitched banshee wail she gave out when she went on overload. Billy was fighting so hard that he was literally foaming at the mouth. The twins just screamed and lashed out at everyone. About half of what was left of the gingerbread man had been ground underfoot. Between Julie and me, we managed to get them apart, to their feet, and into their chairs. Sit, I said, using my most ferocious teacher's voice. Begrudgingly, everyone stayed in their chairs. Now cross your arms and pat your heads down on your desks. The bell rings in just under 5 minutes, so you stay that way until then. Everyone, even Gwynnie, followed those instructions, except, of course, Billy. You too, I said, giving him the evil eye. Can't, he replied with just the faintest hint of defiance. And why is that, might I ask? Because you said pat your head down on your desk and I don't have a desk. He spread his hands wide, palms upward, like he was the most innocent kid in the world. Just got this table. Now, Billy. There was a long look between us. Finally, Billy crossed his arms on the tabletop and laid his head on them. Fucking school, he muttered, and he did so. Thus ended the Chipmunk Spy Club.